They ignored her for years, but one silent act would make the entire valley remember her name by sunrise. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe justice doesn't always need a gun, just a good heart, hit like and follow. Now back to the story. The wind rolled low across Red Hollow, carrying dust that tasted like old wood and forgotten things. Out here, a man could disappear without dying. And sometimes a woman could be erased while still breathing. Lena Tacoma lived at the edge of that forgetting. Her cabin leaned like it had given up trying to stand straight. The roof sagged. One wall had a gap wide enough for cold air to slip through like a thief. No smoke rose from her chimney most days. Not because she didn't need warmth, but because she didn't have anything left to burn. Folks in town knew she was there. They just chose not to remember. An Apache widow. That was enough for them to look the other way. In Red Hollow, people believed what made life easier. And ignoring her made things easier. Ethan Cole rode past that road more times than he could count. Always kept his eyes forward. Always told himself it wasn't his business. A man alone learns that rule quick. Don't get involved. Don't carry what ain't yours. But that night, something didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way the wind hit the cabin, soft, then hollow. Maybe it was the faint sound that slipped through the dark. Not loud, not clear. Just enough to remind him someone was still inside. Ethan pulled the reins. The horse stopped. He didn't move for a while. Just sat there, watching the shape of that broken place against the night sky. Then he exhaled slow, like a man giving up an argument with himself. He dismounted, boots pressed into dry dirt. Each step quiet, deliberate. He didn't knock, didn't call out. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a sack of flour, about 10 pounds. Enough to last a few days, if used carefully. Then a small canteen, half full. Then a folded piece of canvas. Worn, but strong. Good enough to patch a hole, if someone still had the will to try. He set them down by her door. Careful, like placing something sacred. For a second, he stood there, listening. The wind shifted. The wood creaked. And somewhere inside, a faint movement. Ethan didn't wait. Didn't need thanks. Didn't want it. He turned, walked back to his horse, mounted up, and rode off into the dark like nothing had happened. Because out here, the things done in silence were the only ones that mattered. But by morning, Red Hollow would wake up to something it hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not anger, something older, something heavier, and it was already on its way. Morning did not arrive all at once in Red Hollow. It crept in slow, like it had something to think about. The first light touched the hills in a pale gold, then slid down across the dry grass, across the empty road, until it reached the edge of Lena Tacoma's cabin. Inside, the air still held the cold from the night before, but something had changed. The smell, faint but real. Flour, water, canvas that had not yet given up. Lena sat near the door, wrapped in a thin blanket that had seen too many winters. Her hands rested in her lap, still, as if movement might break whatever had happened. She had heard the steps. Not loud, careful, respectful, like someone who understood silence better than words. She had not opened the door then. Out here, trust was something that could cost you everything. But when the wind settled and the sound of hooves faded into the distance, she had waited, counted her breath, then counted again. Only when the world returned to its usual emptiness did she reach for the handle. The wood creaked under her touch. The door opened just enough for the morning air to slip inside. And there it was. The sack, the canteen, the folded canvas. No note, no name, no demand. Lena stared at them for a long moment. Not surprised, not confused, just still, because she knew what it meant when something arrived without a face attached to it. It meant it was not meant to be taken back. She knelt slowly, her joints stiff from nights without rest, and touched the sack. The fabric was rough, real. She pressed her palm against it as if checking whether it might disappear if she blinked. It did not. She brought the canteen close, unscrewed the cap, and paused before drinking. Not from fear, from memory. There had been a time when water came easy, when people knocked on her door for help, not to turn away. That time felt like it belonged to someone else now. She took a small sip, then another, careful, measured, like someone who understood that even kindness had to be rationed out here. Outside, the valley stretched quiet and unchanged. The same fences, the same road, the same people who would pass by without turning their heads. But something unseen had already begun to move. A man in town paused while loading his wagon, glancing toward the hills without knowing why. A woman standing by her porch felt a sudden weight in her chest, like a memory she could not quite reach. And far beyond the ridge, where the road curved out of sight, a single rider slowed his horse. Then another figure joined him. Then another. No words were spoken. None were needed. Back at the cabin, Lena stood in the doorway now, the morning light catching the lines on her face. She looked out across the valley, not expecting anything, not hoping, just observing, because hope had long ago learned to stay quiet around her. But the wind carried something different that morning. Not dust, not cold, something gathering. And though she could not yet see it, the valley had already begun to answer a question no one had dared to ask out loud. By midday, the silence began to feel wrong. Not empty, not peaceful, but waiting. Ethan Cole noticed it first from the ridge above the valley. He had not planned to come back. A man does a thing like that. He leaves it behind. That is the rule. But something in the air pulled him up there, something he could not name, something that did not belong to dust or wind. He sat tall in the saddle, eyes narrowed against the sun, watching the road that curved past Lena Tacoma's cabin. At first, it was nothing. Just heat rising from the ground, bending the horizon. Then a shape. One rider. Slow. Not in a hurry, not lost. Just certain. Ethan shifted slightly, his hand resting near his belt, not gripping, just remembering it was there. The rider did not turn toward town. Did not stop. At the well, he kept going. Straight toward the edge of the valley. Toward her. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a quiet breath. Could be nothing. Could be something. Out here, the difference was usually too late to matter. But then another figure appeared. Then another. Not close together. Not riding as a group. But following the same path, like they had all agreed on something without speaking. Down below, Lena stood in the doorway, the canvas now draped across part of her roof, tied down with strips of worn cloth. It was not perfect, but it held. The wind did not cut through like it had before. She had used the flour sparingly, mixing just enough with water to make something simple, something warm. The smell lingered faintly in the air, unfamiliar after so long without it. She did not look toward the riders at first. Her eyes stayed on the ground in front of her, on the small space where the sack had rested, as if that spot still held weight, as if it meant more than the things themselves. Then she felt it. Not sound, not movement. Presence. The kind that presses lightly against your back until you turn. When she lifted her gaze, she saw the first rider nearing the fence line. He slowed his horse, then stopped a few yards away. He did not call out, did not dismount, just sat there, looking at the cabin, then at her. His face held no anger, no judgment, just something quieter, something harder to explain. Lena did not step forward, did not retreat. She stood still, her posture straight despite the years that had tried to bend it. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then the rider reached behind his saddle and pulled free a bundle. He held it there for a second, as if weighing it, then leaned down and placed it carefully on the ground near the fence. No rush, no hesitation. When he straightened, he gave a small nod. Not to her exactly, not to the cabin, just a nod. Then he turned his horse and rode away the same way he came. No words followed him. No explanation stayed behind. Lena's eyes dropped to the bundle. She did not move toward it yet, because now she could hear more. Hooves. Faint, but growing. From different directions. Ethan saw it clearly. From above now. The road was no longer empty. It was filling. Not fast. Not loud. But steady. Like something that had already decided its path long before anyone noticed. He leaned forward slightly in the saddle, watching as the second rider approached the cabin. Then the third. None of them spoke. None of them stopped each other. Each one carried something. Each one placed it down. Each one left. And with every passing minute, the valley seemed to remember something it had buried too deep to name. Something that did not shout. Something that did not demand. Something that only needed one man to begin and the rest to follow. By late afternoon, the valley no longer pretended to be empty. The road had turned into a quiet procession, not crowded, not hurried, but steady in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Ethan Cole shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking softly beneath him as he watched from the ridge. He had seen cattle drives louder than this, seen storms roll in with more warning, but this moved different. There was no dust cloud rising high, no voices calling out. Just the rhythm of hooves and boots, measured and deliberate, like each step carried weight that did not belong to the ground. Below, the space around Lena Tacoma's cabin had begun to change shape. What had once been bare dirt now held small clusters of things. Firewood stacked in uneven piles. A crate of canned goods set carefully near the fence. A blanket folded twice before being placed down, as if the person who brought it had taken time to think about how it should be received. No one lingered. No one asked questions. They came, they placed what they carried, and they left. But they all paused, just for a second. Not long enough to be called hesitation. Just long enough to feel something. Lena stood near the doorway, her hands resting at her sides. Her shoulders no longer curved inward the way they had been that morning. She had not spoken once. Not to the riders. Not to the wind. Her eyes moved slowly from one person to the next, taking in each face, each gesture. Some she recognized. People who had passed her on the road without a glance. People who had once turned their backs when she stepped into town. They did not meet her eyes now. Not fully. But they did not look away either. It was something in between. Something unfinished. A young boy approached on foot, no older than 10, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He walked slower than the others, his steps uncertain, as if he was not sure he belonged in this quiet line of giving. When he reached the edge of the yard, he stopped, looked back once, as if waiting for someone to call him home. No one did. So he stepped forward and placed the bundle down near the others. It was small. Maybe a loaf of bread. Maybe something less. But the way he set it down made it feel like more. Lena's gaze softened for just a moment. Not a smile. Not quite. Just a shift. Something that had been locked away loosening by a fraction. The boy looked up at her then, quick and unsure, before turning and running back the way he came, his footsteps light against the dirt. Ethan watched it all from above, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharper now. He had expected something to break. A voice raised. A misunderstanding. That was how things usually went when people gathered without speaking. But this held. It stayed quiet. It stayed steady. And that made it heavier. A man rode up next. Older, his posture straight despite the years in his shoulders. He dismounted this time, slower than the others, and carried a long piece of timber in both hands. He walked it all the way to the side of the cabin and leaned it carefully against the wall where the wood had started to split. He stepped back, studied it, then adjusted it slightly, making sure it would hold. Only then did he turn to leave. But before he reached his horse, he stopped. Not facing Lena. Not facing the house. Just standing there for a second, looking out across the valley. As if he was remembering something he had forgotten a long time ago. As if he was measuring the distance between who he had been and who he had become. Then he nodded once to himself and rode off. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the growing collection in front of the cabin. What had started as one man's quiet act had become something else entirely. Not a crowd, not a gathering, something closer to a reckoning. And from the ridge, Ethan Cole finally understood. This was not about the widow. Not anymore. This was about the valley, finding its way back to something it almost lost. The sun dipped low enough to turn the valley gold, but no one spoke of leaving. That was the part that unsettled Ethan Cole the most. People in Red Hollow did not stay where they were not needed. They did not gather without reason. And they certainly did not return, one by one, to the same quiet place unless something inside them had already decided they had to. He eased his horse a few steps down the ridge, not close enough to be seen clearly, but no longer hiding from what was happening. The distance between him and the cabin felt thinner now, like a line drawn in sand instead of stone. Below, Lena Tacoma moved for the first time in a way that was not just watching. She stepped forward, slow and steady, toward the growing line of offerings. Her boots pressed into the dirt where nothing had been before that morning. She paused beside the first bundle, the one placed near the fence hours ago, and knelt again, this time without hesitation. Her hands moved over the items, not claiming them, not sorting them, just feeling them. Each piece carried a different weight, not in pounds, but in intent. A crate of canned beans. Enough for a week, maybe more. A coil of rope, strong and clean, not something a man gives away lightly. A stack of cut wood, measured and even, the kind prepared by someone who knows exactly how much a winter can take. She did not rush. She did not look overwhelmed. She simply took it in, piece by piece, like someone reading a language that had once been familiar. A woman approached next, not on horseback, but walking with careful steps, her hands holding a folded coat. It was thick, lined, the kind worn when the nights turned sharp and long. She stopped a few feet from Lena, closer than the others had dared. For a moment, it seemed she might speak. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. Whatever words she carried did not find their way out. Instead, she stepped forward and placed the coat gently over a wooden crate, smoothing it once with her palm before stepping back. Lena looked at her then, directly, her gaze steady and unbroken. The woman held it for a second, then lowered her eyes, not out of shame, but something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. Then she turned and walked away without looking back. The space between them lingered, filled with everything that had not been said. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, something he had not expected to feel at all. He had done what he did to walk away from it. That was the point. But now, watching it unfold, he understood that walking away did not always mean leaving something behind. Sometimes it meant setting something in motion. More people came. Slower now, but still steady. A man with tools slung over his shoulder. Another with a sack of grain balanced against his hip. Even an older couple, walking side by side, carrying nothing but a small jar, which they placed with the same care as the rest. No one spoke. Not to each other. Not to Lena. But the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It carried weight. It carried meaning. It carried something that could not be taken back once given. The shadows stretched longer across the ground, weaving between boots and bundles, between past and present. Lena arose to her feet again, her posture stronger now, not because of what had been given, but because of what it meant. She turned slightly, her eyes lifting past the people, past the road, until they reached the ridge. She did not search. She knew where to look. Ethan did not move, did not turn away. For a brief moment, across the distance, their eyes met. No nod, no gesture, just understanding. Then she looked back at the valley, at the people who had come without being asked, and the wind carried through the space between them, quiet and certain, as if it already knew this was only the beginning. The light began to fade, but no one rushed to leave. That was when the silence changed again. Not softer, not louder, just deeper, like something had settled into place and was not planning to move. Ethan Cole guided his horse a few more steps down the ridge, slow enough not to draw attention, but close enough now to hear the faint sounds below. Boots against dirt, the quiet shift of wood being set down, the soft creak of leather as someone adjusted their grip before letting go of what they carried. No voices, not even a whisper, and somehow, that made it louder than any crowd he had ever known. Lena Tacoma moved among the offerings now, not collecting, not claiming, but acknowledging. Her fingers brushed over the edge of a wooden crate, paused on the worn handle of a tool, then lifted slightly, as if testing the weight of something unseen. She was not measuring value. She was measuring intention. A man approached with a hammer tucked into his belt and a small box of nails in his hand. He did not stop at the front like the others. He walked to the side of the cabin where the wood had split open from years of neglect. He crouched down, set the box beside him, and began to work. Slow, careful, each nail placed with purpose, each strike measured, not to fix everything, just to begin. Another man joined him, then another, each bringing something different. A plank, a length of wire, a hinge that had seen better days but still held strong. No one asked permission. No one gave orders. They simply saw what needed doing and did it. Lena watched them, her expression unchanged, but her posture no longer carried the weight it had that morning. She stepped back from the doorway, giving space without stepping away. The cabin, once quiet in its decay, began to shift. Not rebuilt, not restored, but remembered. The sound of work filled the air now, not loud, not disruptive, but steady. The kind of sound that tells you something is being put back where it belongs. Ethan felt it in his chest again, that same unfamiliar pull. He had seen men work together before. On ranches, on drives. But that was different. That was for pay, for survival. This had no price attached to it. And that made it rare. A woman returned, the same one who had brought the coat earlier. This time she carried a small lantern, the glass clean, the metal polished. She walked straight to the doorway and hung it on a nail just inside, adjusting it until it sat level. Then she stepped back. and struck a match. The flame caught slow, then steadied, casting a warm glow into the dim interior. For the first time in a long while, light lived inside that cabin before night had fully arrived. Lena's eyes followed the flame, not with surprise, but with something closer to recognition. As if she had seen that kind of light before, long ago, and had been waiting for it to return. The sky above turned deeper, the gold fading into blue, then into something darker. Still, they did not leave. Not all at once. Not even together. They finished what they could. They placed what they had. And one by one, they stepped away. Not hurried. Not relieved. Just complete. Ethan finally let out a slow breath, his grip on the reins easing. He understood now. This was never about fixing a cabin. It was about fixing something quieter. Something that had broken long before the wood did. Lena stepped forward again, standing just outside her door, the lantern light behind her casting a long shadow across the ground. She looked out at the valley, now settling back into its stillness, but not the same stillness as before. This one held something. Something that would not be forgotten as easily. And from the ridge, Ethan Cole watched in silence, knowing that what had started with one quiet act had not ended. It had only just begun to show its shape. The night settled in fully, but the cabin did not fall back into darkness. That was the first thing that made it different. The lantern inside Lena Tacoma's doorway held steady, its glow soft but certain, spilling out across the ground like it had something to prove. Out here, light after sunset was not just comfort. It was a statement. Ethan Cole remained on the ridge longer than he meant to. Most of the valley had already pulled back into its usual shape, silhouettes fading into distance, hooves replaced by quiet, footsteps swallowed by the open land. But the feeling did not leave with them. It stayed, hung in the air like a question that had finally been answered, and now demanded to be understood. He shifted in the saddle, eyes still fixed on the cabin below. It no longer looked like something forgotten, not fully restored, not even close. But the way it stood now, it resisted the idea of being ignored. Like a man who had been silent too long finally deciding to stand straight again. Down below, Lena moved inside the doorway, the lantern light catching the lines of her face as she reached for the coat that had been left earlier. She lifted it carefully, her hand steady, not rushed. The fabric was heavier than anything she had worn in months. Maybe longer. She draped it over her shoulders, adjusting it once, then twice, as if making sure it belonged there. Not borrowed. Not temporary. Just hers. She stepped outside again, the coat resting firmly around her, and looked out across the valley. The same land. The same distance. But something in the way she stood had changed. It was not gratitude. Not relief. It was something quieter. Something rooted. Like she was no longer waiting for the world to pass her by. A faint sound carried through the air. Not hoofs this time. Not footsteps. Something smaller. Closer. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward slightly. There, near the edge of the yard, a figure moved out of the shadows. The young boy from earlier. He had come back. This time, he was not empty-handed. In his arms, he carried a small bundle of kindling, tied together with twine that looked too thin to hold much weight, but held anyway. He hesitated at the edge, just like before, his eyes flicking toward the cabin, then back toward the dark path behind him. Lena saw him. She did not step forward, did not call out. She simply watched. The boy took a breath, then walked in, slower than any rider had, but with more effort in each step. When he reached the small stack of wood already placed near the wall, he knelt down and added his bundle to it. It was not much, not compared to the rest, but he adjusted it carefully, making sure it sat right, making sure it would not fall. When he stood again, he looked up at Lena. This time, he did not look away. For a moment, they held each other's gaze. No words, none needed. Then the boy gave a small nod, almost unsure of himself, and turned to leave. Lena's hand moved slightly, just enough to be noticed, then stopped. Not reaching, not calling him back, just acknowledging. Ethan felt it then, clear as the night air. This was no longer something that would fade with the morning. This had roots now, not in the ground, in people, in choices, in the quiet decision to do something, even when no one was watching. He turned his horse slowly, the leather shifting beneath him, and looked once more at the cabin, the light, the woman standing steady in the doorway. Then he faced the dark road ahead. Because out here, some things were meant to be seen from a distance. And some things were meant to be carried forward without ever being claimed. The night grew deeper, but the valley did not fall asleep the way it used to. Something lingered in the air, quiet but awake, like a fire that no longer needed flames to prove it was still there. Ethan Cole rode slow along the ridge, not leaving yet, not staying either. His eyes drifted back once more toward the cabin, drawn not by curiosity, but by something steadier, something that felt unfinished. Below, the lantern inside Lena Tacoma's doorway still burned, its glow now softer, more settled, casting long shadows that moved gently with the wind. The stacks of wood, the bundles, the tools, they no longer looked like separate offerings. They had begun to form something together. Not a pile, a foundation. Lena stepped inside briefly, then returned carrying a small metal cup. She crouched near the doorway, pouring a little water onto the ground just outside. Not wasteful, not careless, intentional. The kind of gesture that meant something long before words ever could. She watched the water sink into the dry earth, her expression calm, her movements unhurried. Then she set the cup aside and remained there, still, as if listening to something deeper than sound. From the far side of the valley, another figure approached. Not a rider, a man on foot, older, his steps measured but unwavering. He carried nothing in his hands, nothing visible at least. His coat was worn thin, his boots marked by years of walking more miles than most men would choose. When he reached the edge of the yard, he did not stop where the others had. He walked closer, closer than anyone before him. Lena rose, slowly to meet him, her gaze steady, her posture grounded. They stood facing each other, just a few feet apart, the lantern light catching both their faces. The man studied her for a long moment, not with judgment, not with hesitation, but with something that looked like memory. Then, without speaking, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small object. A simple pendant, worn smooth by time, tied to a thin leather cord. He held it in his palm, not offering it yet, just showing it. Lena's eyes lowered to it, and for the first time since morning, something shifted clearly across her face. Not surprise, recognition. The man nodded once, slow and certain, then stepped forward and placed the pendant gently on the wooden crate near the doorway. Not into her hands, not directly, just within reach. When he stepped back, he did not leave right away. He looked at her once more, and this time, Lena gave a slight nod in return. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough. The man turned and walked back into the dark, his figure fading into the night as quietly as he had come. Ethan watched the exchange from above, his jaw set, his eyes sharper now. He did not know what the pendant meant. He did not need to. The way it was given told him everything that mattered. This was no longer about helping. This was about remembering. About returning something that had been lost without anyone noticing when it slipped away. Lena remained by the doorway, her gaze still resting on the pendant, the lantern light flickering softly beside her. She did not reach for it immediately. She let it sit there, as if allowing the moment to settle fully before touching it. The wind moved gently across the valley, brushing past the cabin, past the ridge, past the man who had set all of this in motion without a word. And somewhere in that quiet, something old and buried had finally found its way back to the surface. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough that it could no longer be ignored. The night held steady, but something inside it had shifted into place. Lena Tacoma finally reached for the pendant. Not quickly, not with urgency. Her fingers hovered over it for a brief moment, as if asking permission from something older than memory, then closed around the worn metal. It was smooth from years of being carried, its edges softened by time, its weight light but undeniable. She lifted it slowly, bringing it closer to the lantern's glow. The light caught its surface, revealing faint markings etched deep enough to survive years of silence. Her thumb traced over them once, then again, and her breathing changed, just slightly. Not heavier, not faster, just deeper. Like a part of her that had been quiet too long had finally found something to answer to. She did not put it on right away. Instead, she held it in both hands, steady, grounded, allowing the moment to settle fully before making it part of her again. From the ridge, Ethan Cole watched, his posture still, his gaze fixed. He did not know the history behind that small object, but he understood the weight of something returned. Out here, nothing came back without reason. Nothing carried that kind of silence unless it belonged somewhere. The wind shifted direction, moving across the valley with a softer edge now, brushing past the cabin, past the stacks of wood, past the quiet traces left behind by everyone who had come and gone. It carried the scent of earth, of dust, but also something else now. Something warmer. Something lived in. Lena finally lifted the cord and placed the pendant around her neck. Her hands moved carefully, tying it behind her with a motion that felt practiced, remembered, even if it had been years since the last time. When it settled against her chest, she did not adjust it. She simply let it rest there, as if it had always belonged. She stepped back into the doorway, the lantern light framing her, and looked out across the valley once more. But this time, her gaze did not search. It did not question. It recognized. The same land that had once turned its back now stood quiet before her, not in apology, but in presence. And that was enough. A faint movement caught Ethan's eye again, not near the cabin, but further down the road. More figures. Slower now. Fewer. But still coming. Not out of obligation. Not out of pressure. Simply because something had already been set in motion. And it had not finished yet. He exhaled slowly, his hand resting lightly against the saddle horn, his shoulders easing in a way they had not all day. This was no longer something fragile. It would not disappear with the morning. It had been carried too far for that. Down below, Lena stepped forward one more time, her boots steady against the dirt, the pendant resting quietly against her chest. She walked past the offerings, past the doorway, stopping just at the edge of where the ground met the open valley. She stood there, facing the distance, her posture straight, her presence undeniable. Not asking, not waiting, just standing. The wind moved gently around her, lifting the edges of her coat, brushing past her hair, carrying the quiet weight of everything that had changed in a single day. Ethan watched her for a long moment, then lowered his gaze slightly, not in dismissal, but in understanding. Some things were not meant to be approached. Some things were meant to be witnessed and respected from where they stood. He turned his horse slowly, the motion unhurried, and began to ride along the ridge, not away, not exactly, just forward. Because whatever had been returned to that valley, it was not just hers anymore. It belonged to all of them now, and it was not going anywhere. The valley did not return to what it had been, and that was the quiet truth no one said out loud. By the time the stars settled high above Red Hollow, the movement had slowed, but it had not stopped. A few more figures still came through the dark, not in groups, not in lines, but alone, each carrying something small, something personal, something that could not be measured in pounds or counted in stacks. Ethan Cole rode along the ridge, his pace steady, his eyes still drifting back toward the cabin as if some part of him had not yet finished what he started. The lantern below still burned, a steady glow that refused to flicker out, even as the wind brushed against it from different directions. That light had become more than a flame. It had become a marker, a place the valley could no longer pretend not to see. Lena Tacoma remained near the edge of her doorway, the pendant resting against her chest, her coat pulled close around her shoulders. She had not stepped back inside. Not fully. It was as if she understood that this moment did not belong behind walls. It belonged out here, where it could be seen, even in silence. Another man approached, slower than the rest, his horse walking instead of riding hard. He carried no bundle, no tools, nothing visible at all. When he reached the edge of the yard, he dismounted carefully, his boots landing soft against the dirt. He removed his hat, not in ceremony, not in performance, but in something quieter. Respect. He stood there for a moment, hat in hand, his gaze not fixed on Lena, but on the ground between them. Then he nodded once, placed the hat back on his head, and turned to leave without placing anything down. But the absence of an object did not make his presence any lighter. If anything, it carried more weight. Lena watched him go, her expression unchanged, but her eyes followed him longer than the others. Because she understood something most did not. Not everything that is given can be held. Some things are offered simply by showing up. Ethan slowed his horse as he reached the far end of the ridge, then stopped completely. The valley stretched out before him, no longer empty, no longer distant. It had shifted into something else. Something that could not be undone by morning. He looked back one last time. The cabin stood steady now, not perfect, not whole, but no longer forgotten. The stacks of wood, the tools, the small bundles, They formed a quiet barrier against the past, a line drawn not with force, but with choice. Lena stood within that line, not protected, not rescued, but restored in a way that did not need words. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth, and something else that had not been there before. Something like memory returning to a place it had once belonged. Ethan let out a slow breath, then gave a slight nudge to his horse. The animal stepped forward, carrying him along the ridge, away from the view, but not away from what it meant. Because some acts are not meant to be followed. They are meant to be left behind, so others can find them. And down below, as the last of the riders disappeared into the night, the lantern by Lena Tacoma's door continued to burn, not as a signal, not as a warning, but as a quiet promise that the valley had remembered something it should have never forgotten in the first place. The night did not end with silence. It carried forward into something that waited. By the time the first pale line of dawn touched the far edge of Red Hollow, the valley had already begun to shift again. Not with noise, not with movement, but with presence. Ethan Cole had not ridden far. He had stopped at a low bend in the ridge where the land dipped just enough to hide him from sight, but not from the horizon. He sat there through the night, not sleeping, not restless, just watching the slow turn of darkness into light. Some things a man does not leave halfway. Down below, the lantern at Lena Tacoma's doorway had burned through the night, its flame smaller now, but still holding. When the first light of morning reached it, the glow did not disappear. It blended. Natural, like it had always been part of the place. Lena stepped out just as the sun began to rise, her movements steady, her shoulders carrying a different kind of weight now. Not burden, not survival, something quieter, belonging. The pendant rested against her chest, catching the early light for a brief second before settling back into stillness. She paused at the edge of her doorway, her eyes scanning the valley, not searching, not expecting, just aware. Then she saw it. At first, it looked like shadow, then shape, then movement. Far across the valley floor, lines began to form. Not scattered this time, not one by one. Together, riders, dozens, then more. They did not rush. They did not call out. But they came with direction, with purpose that could be felt even from a distance. Ethan straightened slightly in the saddle, his eyes narrowing as he counted without meaning to. 10, 20, more behind them. Not a crowd, not chaos. Something organized, something decided. The sound reached them next. Hooves against the earth, low and steady, like a heartbeat carried across miles. Lena did not step back, did not retreat inside. She stood where she was, her coat still wrapped around her, the morning light touching her face, her posture unmoving. The riders drew closer, spreading slightly as they approached, not surrounding, not closing in, but forming a wide arc before the cabin. One by one they slowed. One by one they stopped. No dust cloud, no raised voices, just stillness on a larger scale than the valley had ever held before. Then something changed. The first rider dismounted. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, boots pressing into the same ground where so many had stood the day before. He did not reach for anything, did not speak. He simply lowered himself down to one knee. The second followed, then the third, then more. Not all at once, not commanded, but understood. Ethan felt it then, clear and undeniable. This was not about giving anymore. This was not about fixing. This was something else entirely. Lena's expression did not break, but her breathing slowed, her chest rising and falling with something deeper than surprise. The valley was not just remembering. It was choosing to stand different, to see different, to be something it had not been before. And in that quiet, as the first line of riders knelt before her without a single word spoken, the morning did not feel like a beginning. It felt like an answer. No one spoke, and yet everything that needed to be said stood there in the open. The line of riders remained still, their knees pressed into the dust of a land that had once turned away, now held in a silence that carried more weight than any voice could manage. The morning light stretched across their shoulders, across their hats, across the ground between them and Lena Tacoma, turning the entire valley into something that felt, witnessed. Ethan Cole did not move on the ridge. He did not need to come closer to understand what he was seeing. This was not a moment meant to be interrupted. It was meant to be held. Down below, Lena stood steady, her hands resting loosely at her sides, the pendant against her chest catching the light with each slow breath she took. She did not step forward right away. She let the silence settle fully, let the valley finish what it had begun. One of the riders, an older man with weathered hands and a back that had seen too many seasons, lifted his head slightly. His eyes met hers, not in challenge, not in plea, but in something far more honest. Acceptance. Then he rose to his feet. Not quickly, not as a leader, just as a man who had reached the end of something and chosen to stand differently. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the edge of her yard. His boots pressed into the ground that had been crossed so many times without notice. This time, every step mattered. He removed his hat again, holding it against his chest, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he might speak. His lips parted slightly, then closed. Whatever words had lived there were not needed anymore. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, handled more than once. He walked the final few feet and placed it carefully on top of the wooden crate near her doorway, right beside the pendant that had already found its place. He did not hand it to her. He did not look for permission. He simply left it where it could be found. When he stepped back, he did not return to his place in the line. He stood off to the side, no longer kneeling, no longer separate, just present. One by one, the others began to rise. Not all at once, not in unison, but in a quiet understanding that had passed between them without a word. They did not rush forward. They did not crowd her. They simply stood, facing her, no longer above, no longer apart. Lena finally stepped forward then, slow, measured, her eyes moving across the faces before her. Some she recognized, some she did not, but the difference no longer mattered. She reached the crate and looked down at the folded paper. Her hand hovered over it for a moment, then lifted it gently. The edges were soft from use, the surface marked by time. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers careful, as if whatever was written inside carried more than ink. Her eyes moved across the page, and though her expression did not change, something in the way she held herself shifted again. Not heavier, not lighter, just clearer. She folded it back with the same care and placed it beside the pendant, not taking it inside, not hiding it away, letting it remain where it had been given. Then she looked up, not at one person, at all of them. The valley did not look away this time, and for the first time since anyone could remember, the space between them held no distance at all. No one moved to break the moment, and yet something had already changed in a way that could not be undone. The valley stood there, no longer divided by distance or silence, but held together by something far quieter and far stronger. Lena Tacoma remained where she was, the folded paper resting beside the pendant, the morning light now fully settled across her shoulders. She looked at the people before her, not as strangers, not as those who had once turned away, but as something else entirely. Not forgiven, not judged, just seen. And in that seeing, something long buried had found its way back into the open. A breeze moved through the valley, light and steady, brushing past coats and faces, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and wood and something warmer than either. It passed through the line of people, through the space between them, and reached her without resistance. Lena took a slow breath, her chest rising gently, and for the first time, she stepped forward not because she had to, but because she chose to. Just one step. It was enough. The people did not step back. They did not step forward. They simply remained where they were, holding the space, allowing her movement to be her own. That was the difference now. No one was deciding for her anymore. No one was deciding without her. From the ridge, Ethan Cole watched the step, and something in his expression eased, something that had been held tight since the night before finally loosening. He did not smile. Men like him rarely did. But the way his shoulders settled, the way his gaze softened just slightly, it said enough. He had done what he came to do, even if he had not known it at the time. Down below, Lena reached the crate once more and lifted the folded paper again, not to read it, but to hold it alongside the pendant. One hand carried the past, the other, the return of it. She stood there for a moment, the two resting in her hands, then lowered them both back in a place where everyone could see. Nothing hidden, nothing taken away, everything shared in the open. The older man who had brought the paper gave a small nod, almost to himself, and turned his gaze out across the valley, not away from her, but forward. Others followed that motion, not leaving, but looking outward, as if the valley itself had become something worth facing again. One by one, without signal, without command, the people began to step back. Not retreating, not withdrawing, simply giving space where space was now deserved. They moved with the same quiet intention that had brought them there, their presence no longer pressing, no longer heavy, but steady in a different way. A foundation laid, not a weight carried. Lena remained where she was, watching them go, not alone this time, but not surrounded either. Just standing. The cabin behind her held light. The ground before her held proof. And the valley beyond her held something it had almost lost. Ethan turned his horse at last, guiding it along the ridge without looking back again. Not because it no longer mattered, but because it no longer needed him to witness it. Some things, once set right, do not require watching. They require trust. The sun climbed higher, the shadows shortened, and Red Hollow settled into its day, not as it had been, but as something quieter, stronger, and more honest. And if anyone had asked what changed, there would have been no single answer. Just a silence that felt different. A silence that held meaning. Out here, justice did not arrive with noise or force. It arrived the way it always had, in the hands of one person willing to act, and a valley willing, at last, to remember.